Seu Saad, acho que não entrou lá no YouTube, hein? Não começou lá. Agora sim.
Entrou agora.
Boa tarde. Boa tarde a todos e
Good
todas.
afternoon, everyone.
Vamos dar início agora à nossa
Let us now begin
palestra especial número 3
our special keynote number 3
Nacional Pan-Americano
of the second Pan American International Symposium on Toponymy, the second edition of our Congress.
Ele tá carregado de informações
Is full of very special information about toponymy, cartography, linguistics, especially with respect to the needs of this science on a national level, but also with a lot of conceptual discussions that were brought by Brazilian and international speakers. Well, this session is devoted to the special keynotes Professor Leila dos Santos Andrade Klinger and Professor Renato Amado Peixoto. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. So Professor Renato Amado Peixoto is a professor of graduate studies and of the Department of History of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte state in Brazil. He studied history in the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and he has a PhD on history by the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Professor Leila Klinger, she studied languages in the University of Tocantins. She has a master's and a PhD in linguistics by the University of São Paulo. She is an associate professor of the Federal University of Tocantins, and she works on graduate programs of languages of the UFT and of the Federal University of the North of Tocantins state in Brazil as well. Professor Leila is experienced in linguistics with emphasis on lexical studies, especially working on onomastics, toponymy, and thematics that have to do with teaching. She also does research on anthropology, linguistics, with a focus on the knowledges of the traditional peoples of Tocantins state. And she works with a scholarship from CNPq entity of Brazil. So welcome both speakers. I'd like to thank you very much for your availability and of being here in our second symposium on toponymy. And so a very brief message to you. I'd like to remind everyone who's listening here and also watching by means of the Zoom, we have simultaneous translation into English, and those of you on YouTube and those of you here, you can put your comments on the chat of these two channels. And at the end of the lectures, we will ask our lecturers. All right, so let us begin with the first lecture by Professor Renato Amado Peixoto. Thank you, Manuel. Good afternoon, everyone who's here with me. Could you please show? Is it all right? So I am going to work with you on a theme that I've been developing, research about the world of fantasy. I work with several authors Robert Howard, Tolkien, and here I separated for you to talk about geographical names and toponymy, this presentation that I called Toponymy of the Fantasy Worlds. It's a case study of the invention of Hyboria by Robert Howard. So to begin, I'd like to put three matters here that I hope can answer during the presentation. The first would be, is the study of literary toponymy interesting to those who study the toponymy of the real world? How can the creators of fantasy worlds produce a toponymy of these worlds that they created? And finally, how useful is the study of the toponymy of the fantasy worlds for the toponymy of the real world? So we will try to answer these questions. And first of all, I'd like to show you this author, who's Robert Howard. He was most well known as the creator of a character, Conan, the Barbarian. Is omnipresent in the media until today. Everybody knows him, RPGs, role-play games, video games, and the texts from Robert Howard, who have been everywhere in books and pages of the internet. He's really well known for this Conan the Barbarian, but Robert Howard wrote a lot more, and he worked with several different styles and genres of the literature. And he created several characters, but we will focus our discussion on this character who's most well known. And to put here on our presentation, it's enough to say that Robert Howard will constitute an entire fantasy world called Hyboria, so that the stories of his character could live in this place. So it's interesting to say that this fantasy world about which we will talk and see how Robert Howard reasoned and how he produced, what are the things that he received to produce this fantasy world. And we can examine all of that by means of several sources that are available to all. The passive and active letters with a lot of authors, including Lovecraft, and the drawings by Robert Howard that were published by his foundation in the United States, the poetry books by Robert Howard. Many people don't know, but he was also a poet. But they have a lot of information for those of you who would like to work on a theme that is related to Robert Howard, in addition to his texts that are related to Conan, the character, and other characters like Ben McMorney, Solomon King, and others, many other characters. In any case, how did Robert Howard create this world of Hyboria? The act of creating a fantasy world, fantasies that are common to many authors, you can see in the 19th and 18th century that we have that, but also in the 20th century, a lot of authors, as I mentioned, Tolkien, Lovecraft, Robert Howard, they created worlds that were very well made, very well created. And these authors wrote stories about them, about these worlds. They wrote maps, they created maps about them, and they created very detailed descriptions about their spaces and all of that. And we have toponymy there as well. So what were the reasons for which these authors produced toponymy? And our case study then is what are the reasons and what are the inputs by means of which Robert Howard was able to articulate all of this background for his Conan stories. So I put that here in this presentation, in this more generic name. So the inputs that enabled Howard's effort to toponymize Hyboria. And you might ask, well, what did, where did this name Hyboria come from? We have a lot of texts and biographies written about Robert Howard. It is an academic study, and most experts say that the name Hyboria was brought by Robert Howard before the creation of his character. And the first record of it is a letter written to Lovecraft in 1932. And he wanted to make a reference to the Greek toponym Hyperborea, which is a frozen world on the north where heroes and characters lived. There's another hypothesis that should be studied but not very well known, in which at that time there was a magazine devoted to adventure texts, and that was called the Hyborian Age. So maybe it was a merge of these two matters, but in any case, the name of this world came before he created the Conan character and before he created an entire choreography and an entire story about this world. So the name of the world came before. In either case, people are still arguing which hypothesis is the correct one. But the inputs for the creation of this world, Hyboria, I believe we can investigate them by means of the life story of this author, Robert Howard. So it's important to say that. He was the son of a physician, and this physician traveled a lot in the countryside of Texas in the United States until he decided to live in a small town called Cross Plains. And this town was founded by religious fundamentalists. And it was the hometown of Robert Howard, who did not get used to this world, which was very far away from what he had before with his parents in other towns. And so Robert Howard became detached from the society, far away from those who lived on Cross Plains. So this is a first thing that is interesting to know. The second is that Texas in the 1920s was going through a lot of matters related to oil. And even the letters of Robert Howard caused turmoil in the society of Texas, and it caused trouble to Robert Howard as well. The confusion, workers worked in the oil industry because oil was very much a thing at that time. And a lot of things came from that. The troubles and workers' troubles, prostitution, a lot of things that had to do with the success of petroleum at this time in Texas. And it's interesting to say that Robert Howard was a descendant from the Irish. I know that there might be Irish people listening to us. But this always haunted Robert Howard in a sense. He was a victim of prejudice because we know that during the time in which he lived, the Irish were counted as separate from the other inhabitants of the United States, very much like African Americans and the Jewish people. So he had to deal with that too. So this prejudice, this feeling of an outcast allowed to forge the character of Conan the Barbarian, who lived apart from the society as well. And he was different from the society, disagreed with society. So Howard developed a lot of interest in ancient history. He wanted to understand how the people who came before him established, and the Irish, and how they lived in Ireland, and then how did they go to the United States. And then he studied a lot of different eras, and he studied especially in particular the age in which he put everyone from the characters, the Bronze Age. And he also wrote to Lovecraft. He exchanged letters with him. So Robert Howard, despite living in a small town in Texas, he had a literary discussion environment that was very broad. He exchanged letters with people from everywhere in the United States, and intellectuals. All of them were scholars and intellectuals. So that also influenced his work because he had a lot of impression from these authors, among which the matters that Lovecraft in his tales worked, issues about esotericism and horror. And something else came about because of this interest in esotericism as background for his tales. He adopted the myths of theosophy, which is an esoterical religion, and for the environment of Hyboria. So Hyboria will be a world that came before other worlds. His interest in theosophy. So these worlds would exist in eras that might be extinguished because of other catastrophes, for example, Atlantid, which would be one of these eras. So he came up with this era as one which would be which would come out of theosophy. And finally, it's necessary to say that Robert Howard had a literary universe. He wrote his stories to everyone. And at the time, that was called pulp fiction. It was cheap magazines, part of newspapers. That's why they called pulp. It was a pulp of newspapers that gave rise to these magazines. And these magazines were for the working class. And so he wrote specifically for this audience. And what's more, his universe, his lettering universe, he used to read great encyclopedias, which were the vehicle of knowledge at that time. So we have a record from the books that Robert Howard had, and among them, there were 13 encyclopedias, and they help us think about what did he have access to. In a certain way, we already discussed or mentioned the toponymy of Robert Howard. Here we have a first exemplary of a map from the cartography. And this was extracted from a role-playing game. It's called Conan the Role-Playing Game. It's from 2004. And here we have the map of Hyboria. I'd like you to see that it is very extensive from west to east, west to the east. It has a sea and a characteristics that we see that is not seen in older maps. There's no name, unfortunately, for this drawing, which is very beautiful. And we can go to an even older one from 1986, which was drawn by Tony Edwards and is part of a series of books called The Savage Sword of Conan. You can see that this world of Hyboria, it grows smaller. So we know that it grows with time, and that's what I wanted to mention to you. So let's go to an even older specimen of the cartography of Hyboria. So the other one was The Savage Sword of Conan. So here we have a map from 1950. It's an edition of a novel, the only one written by Robert Howard for Conan. It's called Conan the Conqueror, and later it was called Hour of the Dragon. That was a map produced by David Kyle. And you can see that now we already have the east part of the world of Hyboria. So in 1950, for those who worked with the Conan universe at this time, Robert Howard had passed away. He committed suicide in 1930 with, and he was 30 years old. So you see that this world is even smaller now. And finally, in 1938, we have the first cartography of Hyboria, the so-called Lenny map. And that was drawn by two fans of Robert Howard called Schuyler and Clark. And these fans took the map to Robert Howard. Robert Howard authorized what they did. So we can see that this first map is the first one official, that is official from 1938. He died in 1936, but this was only published in 1938. There's also an edition of his tales. So where did this come from? How can we investigate the toponymy of the map? You see that I already mentioned to you all of those inputs, right? All of the information that was relevant to this, but here we need to go beyond that. Where did he get the content of this map from? So you can see that this is a discussion. And I told you that one of the lettering contents of Robert Howard was encyclopedia. He took a lot of things from there. So he is a person who studied a lot. He was a scholar, and he researched in the books and encyclopedias that he had until he saw this map of Europe. And he thought that this had something to do with that world that he created, Hyboria. So he had the following idea. He said, I will trace this world on paper. I will use this and I will put it on top of the Western European map from this Compton's Encyclopedia of 1924. So he just drew one thing on top of another. This cartographic engineering called Scott Henderson from the British Columbia University, in one of his texts called Howard McMaps and his definitive source, he shows, Scotty Henderson, he shows the results to which he had access. And we can be sure that he drew on a map of Europe, Western Europe, and that's how Howard created his toponyms, because he drew the cartography of his world. You can see the dotted line, the exercise that Scotty did to show the world of Hyboria. And in the other lines, you can see the drawing of Western Europe. Now, let's go to, because I'm bringing you a picture, it's not very good, but it came from the complete drawings of Robert Howard, which were published in 2009 by the Robert Howard Foundation. And here, you can see that the hypothesis is correct. There's a map in the drawings, and it's called map A. And nowadays, we believe that it was drawn in 1932. And you can see the world of Hyboria by using this. Here we can see map B, with the same exercise done by Robert Howard, and map C finally, which is precisely the same thing. So those are 3 attempts to get to this world of Hyboria that was done on top of the European, Western European map. So we have to take into consideration all of these things. We need to think about all of it when we do what we do. So Robert Howard had such and such universe, he had such and such a life path, he thought about these things, and by means of rationalizing all of that and studying the Western European map and transforming it based on the information that he had about the Bronze Age in Europe, and doing all that, we can see the creation of Hyboria. So I extracted a few examples of toponyms created by Robert Howard just to show you in my presentation. So, oh, sorry, below here, I wanted to write one of the same drawings of Howard so that we could see. I think this is map B. So Chimera, I can see that it has to do with the Scythians, which was an ancient nomad people that was Proto-Indo-European. And Robert Howard, by means of his studies on the Bronze Age, he got to know the people and he brought to Hyboria. And you can see that Robert Howard marries this world with the sense of thinking that they settled Wales, England, Scotland, and Ireland. So the Cimmerian people would be the ones who originated the Irish, and maybe Conan the Barbarian. So you can see that Chimera, and maybe you can see here, I don't know if you can see, I am pointing here that Chimera would be here on the map. So Aquilonia, which is here on the map where I'm showing you now with the mouse. Aquilonia is precisely on top of France. So the toponym, the geographical name Aquilonia, came from a region of France. And you can note that the people who came from Hyboria do not have the information that we're having now of this having been drawn on top of a map of France. Only we are able to see that. It would be equivalent to Aquitaine. Another state that Robert Howard draws on his world, which is called Zingara, is where we could see the Iberic Peninsula. And why did he call that Zingara? Because of his readings, and he saw gypsy people there, and gypsy folklore and gitana music that existed in Spain at the time. So he gives the name of Zingara because this name has to do with the gypsy world, povo cigano in Portuguese and gitano in Spanish. So this is a translation of this word. And he's also going to situate this world in the Spanish city of Zamora, precisely because of that, because he did this approximation, let's say. And here below, we have a river called, in the tales, it's called Styx River. And this Styx River, this toponym, comes from Greek culture, Greek mythology. It meant the Greek underworld. And here, he does a transformation of what would be the geography of the real world. He removes the Nile River from his original position in Egypt, and he puts that transversely in relation to the original position. But we can see on the map that he calls the Nile River. So this area below the Nile, which would be Egypt, in the real world, he's going to call that Stygia, which means underworld, which means below. So you can see that on the map, Stygia is below Greece. So this information, we can only have that if we look at the cartography of Hyboria and in the real world. There would be no means to get this information from another source. And the last example of toponym is Shem, which would be on a real world map, would be Turkey, the Middle East approximately. And Shem on the Bible is one of the successors of Noah. And he's considered the father of the Arabic and Persian peoples in the Islamic tradition. So you can see that this area will have the name of Shem because it is on top of the places inhabited by these people in the real world. So those are the examples of toponyms created by Robert Howard so as to inform the development of the cartography of Hyboria. Everything that came afterwards, the expansion of Hyboria, was done by means of mechanisms that Robert Howard built. The authors copied what he did many times with this information that we have. So Kitai will be China, Vidya would be India, and from then on. And so to conclude my presentation, I'd just like to put here final considerations. I believe that the literary toponymy is an interesting dialogical field for the toponymy of the real world, as it reveals and informs methods, theories, and allows for reasonings about the production and transformation of geographical names. The production of the toponymy of these fantasy worlds is done by means of conditions that are very close to the ones that operate on the creation of geographical names in the real world. And finally, the study of the toponymy of the fantasy world and of the literary field as a whole in literature is extremely relevant on the academic point of view, and it should be investigated as a lab for the study of the production of place names in the real world. So that's what I had to say. I'm sorry if I spoke more than I should have in the time that was given to me. Thank you very much. And bye-bye. No, that was fine, Renato. Your presentation was fascinating. I just have a comment here that's very significant from Professor Gary, and he wrote here that it is fascinating, and all of that was new to him. He said that he's sitting there in Dublin and he's learning all about that by means of Brazil. So that was very cool. Yeah. I was also transported to a few projects that we have in the Department of Geography by a group that works in the theory of geography, in which they work on the geography of comic books. So they analyze the geographical spaces of comic books. So for example, Limoeiro neighborhood from the Turma da Mônica, it's a very famous comic book in Brazil, would be in contrast to the Gotham City of those comic books of Batman. That's very interesting. And your maps, the ones that you presented from Howard, they lead us to discussions that we have, even to interact more with students, right? In when they study cartography at the university, because cartography goes beyond what can be mapped and what is known in the surface of the earth. It also has to do with our imagination. And even Professor Paulo Menezes always shows the map of the Middle Earth from Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, and also maps from series, and Maruto map was one in Harry Potter, and if you remember the books, you know, people were walking around the map, and so there's a world to explore, the Marauders map. So those are things that should be studied, and also the toponymies that are discussed in the literary places and that are in there in those maps. So thank you very much for your presentation. That was wonderful. So now I will pass the floor to the presentation of Professor Careleila. It's your floor. He also mentioned Game of Thrones, the map that's shown there, but I missed it. All right, so Professor Careleila. Good afternoon, Professor. Before you share the screen, could you please stop that and do that on the presentation mode, please? He's talking about the presentation on full view.
Modo de apresentação.
É o último, o
Modo de
próximo.
exibição aqui, não é? Isso.
Isso.
Pronto.
Não, então, para a gente não funciona. Faz o seguinte, descompartilha a tela para o compartilhamento,
Ok.
põe em modo de apresentação agora, com a tela cheia, e depois compartilha de novo.
Espera aí, que eu só tenho que abrir aqui a telinha.
Isso.
Eu não estou conseguindo abrir a telinha e abrir a apresentação.
Aperta Alt Tab que vai aparecer. Aí, quando aparecer ela,
Alt Tab.
Isso. Até aparecer ela.
Tá.
Cada sistema é diferente, né?
O meu não está indo. Espera aí. Agora foi. Só um minuto.
Isso.
E agora?
Não, eu acho que você não botou para compartilhar. Botou já para compartilhar?
E olha que a gente treinou, né?
Pior que funcionou direitinho, né?
Funcionou direitinho, entende? Vamos ver agora.
Não veio em modo de apresentação, só veio o PowerPoint mesmo.
Ai, eu não estou conseguindo.
Você quer que eu apresente daqui?
Por favor, se você puder, vai
Aí você vai
facilitar a minha
pedindo e eu vou mudando
Isso.
aqui.
Você vai vendo que a gente vai fazendo assim. Bom,
Tá, joia.
enquanto o Manuel vai
Well,
organizando.
while Manuel is putting the presentation, we trained all of this people. We did it all before, but well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizing committee for the invitation. Professor Paulo Menezes, thank you so much for that. We've been together since the first SIPAT, the first conference, and this is the second. I hope we have the third, the fourth, and others in presence, because I think that when it is in presence, it's we have more warmth and we are able to even get closer, as in the work of the professor, which is brilliant, and we realize how toponymy is rich. And I remembered the literary toponymy of Guimarães Rosa, a Brazilian author. So I'd also like to thank Raquel. And I said a little while back that she's almost omnipresent. She's present in many places at the same time. And I'd like to say that since day number one, we are having fantastic lectures and I've been learning a lot. I believe a great event is when you learn, when you see that there are different things and we are always open to interact. So thank you very much to all of you. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the thematic areas, which is toponymy and teaching. And SIPAT defined toponymy and education, and I am doing something that has more to do with schools. And it's been a challenge to think about this database focusing, first of all, because the first focus was more academic, it was a study group, it was a work group, GT of the lexicon. But in the second moment, in another moment, we thought about extending that to a more collaborative work. We are located in the state of Tocantins in Brazil, here in the center of the country. It's the north and the center of the country in the north region. And the state of Tocantins is a state with a population that's very small, 1,700,000 inhabitants, and we have the Federal University of Tocantins there. And we developed this work of the atlas, a toponymic atlas, and our main focus now, we have 3 lines of research: the toponymic of traditional people. So we work a lot with indigenous peoples. We also work on the toponymy of teaching and urban toponymy. So we are focused on these 3 lines specifically. An important thing to say is that we already have a few theses that are ongoing, and some of them have been concluded. And we are have with this challenge, which is a big one, which is to think and work and produce material thinking about toponymy and teaching, because at first it seemed to be something very simple. You know, thinking about toponymy, because the nature of toponymy is interdisciplinary. Toponymy is interdisciplinary by nature. It's an area that has this characteristic, but this did not account, this was not enough to answer specific matters that pertained to education. So when we went to work on toponymy in teaching, something that we had to do was think about the theory of interdisciplinarity. And when we looked at the discussion of the discipline itself, toponymy in Brazil, almost all of the studies are on toponymy, and in Europe and other countries, they work with pure toponymastics. But when we think about that, we have these 3 here. We have the pure toponymastics, etymologic toponymy, and applied toponymastics. That's a work, Introducción a la Toponomástica, de Robert Pocklington, and he talks about this applied toponymastics. And based on that, we studied the theory and the methods so that we could study toponymy applied to teaching in order to meet the needs of the schools. Because we had one question: are we studying applied toponymastics to serve whom? And why are we studying that? Otherwise, we would be focusing solely on the academic surroundings, the scholarly surroundings. And when we go beyond the walls of the university, we face another reality. So to set foot on the school is different from setting foot on an university. I would even say that in the university, we have asphalt on the floor. It's different depending on the community. And thinking about the indigenous communities, they have schools on the dirt, on the soil. So it's different. And this makes us think about interdisciplinarity. And when we think about the pure toponymastics, we are thinking of a scientific interdisciplinarity in which the knowledges interact, the scientific knowledges, they are interconnected, and I would say that the motivation is scientific studies. And when I think about applied toponymastics, I have to advance a little bit about the discussion on the interdisciplinarity, because it's not only the focus on the knowledge in terms of the scientific interdisciplinarity, but the focus, I need to rethink the focus, because the focus is on the school. So the scientific interdisciplinarity is not the same as the school interdisciplinarity, because it's another context. The actors are different, the dialogue is different, and we need to rethink the focus as being on teaching and learning. And so to know, and this knowledge of knowing, to go to the second moment in which this social coordination to meet the needs, and then I go to a second stage of this social order in the concept of interdisciplinarity, then I have to go to a third level for that, which is a focus on the student, which is knowing how to be. So I go from knowing to know, this scientific interdisciplinarity in pure toponomastics, to reach the applied toponomastics and to think of this knowing and being. And so who is this being? And the question is, why am I studying that? Why should I think of pedagogical propositions that are applied to teaching? So that made us rethink. And so we started to go back to what in fact was interesting to schools, which are the program, the curriculum, official documents, and the structure of the school itself. Who are the professors and the teachers? What's the education of those teachers and students? So in this sense, we had to establish a few things that had to do with changing perspectives and terminology. Toponymy is a language cultural complex. We study toponymy, and this toponymy sign is specific and studied and understood by means of the linguistic studies. This is very important. And afterwards, we can transcend to other areas. So in this context, I'm working with what I said before, scientific interdisciplinarity. In a second stage, that's where I start to think, and that made us readjust our proposal, which is school interdisciplinarity. And for that, it was important to define terminology, which was already used in a few countries, which is toponomastics, toponym, and toponomastics. So to define these three terms was important. So we were based on a book, a prologue from Coserio, Toponymic Atlas of the Canarias, from Trapero, and he differentiates toponomastics, which would be the study area, the discipline that studies proper names. Toponymy would be a group of place names, and toponym would be the product, would be the name itself. So this terminology, we started to use this terminology in our studies. Well, in this sense, we defined this interdisciplinarity, this school interdisciplinarity, in which the focus would be to think about the process itself of how the student learns. And for that, we are using multilateral theory as well, because the purpose of the school, and this made us think based on a question raised by a teacher, because we took a few proposals that we studied in our university in our little boxes, and then he asked us, well, what am I going to do with that? This has no relation with the objects of knowledge that I should be working with. They might even have some, but I have a sequence of things that I have to do. I have goals that I have to meet. I have a program that I have to follow. I have a pedagogical project that I have to work with. And we just got there with ideas that had to do with it. They contemplate a bit of the objects, a few skills, but we needed to be closer to them to understand how this teacher, for example, needed to work and how we could meet his needs, and to get to know who the teacher was and what was his pedagogical proposal. That was important so that we could think together with him and think about his needs. and demands. And then political matters, social matters, motivational, anthropological, and the education, the training of this teacher, for example, and even more so than that, the interdisciplinarity here, thinking about autonomy, is almost being bold and daring, because you know you have the content, and in no moment you're going to find the term toponym in this case, but we have a lot of objects of knowledge in which toponyms and geographical names, they walk together, they go through that. So we realize that the study cannot be horizontalized, it needs to be verticalized. And here we have something to think about. What is the concept of innovation for this proposal? And innovation is made precisely by rethinking and reassessing these goals. And now is the time for the group to leave our comfort zone and to talk directly with the schools and to see what their needs are. So we wanted to give workshops for these teachers and extension courses for them. And we are in contact with Professor Marcia from UniOeste and Professor Alexandre from UFAC, and we are preparing extension courses that will be offered to basic education teachers. And those workshops are pedagogical workshops. And we're going to work on toponymy in our mother tongue and also in sign language. So this is something that we've been asking. We ask ourselves, because we're thinking and preparing these activities for whom? So this concept of innovation is a concept that is very much in need, because it's a concept to reassess. I think the prefix that we have here, it's essential for us to think about it. What are the proposals? What do we want? And the proposal of the data base is precisely, in this perspective that has to do with diversity of discourse and genres that go through several political and social spheres, and that our students themselves are in touch, in permanent touch with several places that are multimodal and multi-semiotics. Are the schools ready for that? Are the teachers ready for all of that? So how can we move this around? And so that's why this database now, it's not just a database that only wants to catalog and describe these toponyms that we are identifying, which are the results of theses and dissertations and all these other academic works. No, now this second and third stages and goals, they're very dear to us. They're very precious. We want to enable teachers from basic education. We want to give them the results of our research. And in a certain way, they can get the toponym of these traditional communities, the traditional peoples. So we're working on a tab that's specific of the toponymy of the indigenous communities, traditional communities, communities that came from the slaves. And so we want to have work that has a close dialogue with the teachers. And a third thing, which would be very precious to us as well, is a collaborative work. Students, as well as teachers, can collaborate with information, either with a name of a square or a story that he knows from a river or a shop or square or street or the avenue, the Sierra. I mean, we are trying, well, not trying, we are doing precisely that. We want the database to be collaborative. We want students and teachers and professors and the community as a whole to also feed the database with toponymic information. And for that, the work with multi-lettering is one option, one methodological approach for us to be included in this context in the schools. So we are studying here the place as a category in the toponomastic studies. And what are we working on here? A place as a category. In onomastics, we know that a place is a category in geography, but we are considering places as categories within the toponomastic studies that have to do with linguistics. So we understand place as an analytical in dimension, which is motivational, historical, linguistic, ideological, social, and as an identity. It is about the extension, apprehension of the motivational relations that are established between proper names and place names. It is their genesis. So this is another study. It's another front that we have in terms of work to publish articles and to study, obviously, with Professor Carolina, who is from the geography area, and she has helped us with a lot of readings, and she has helped with students as well. And so where do we begin? Within this extension, thinking of places as a category, it's worth thinking about other things too, like knowing the etymology and the origin of the names, understanding the importance of the acknowledgement of the social memories in order to preserve identities and the sense of belonging, especially in indigenous communities, within the schools, the names of the schools, the names of the indigenous communities. All of this becomes a sense of belonging that is related to a cosmovision of all of the knowledges of those communities. So this is also very valuable to us and for these communities as well. To study the cultural landscape and linguistic landscape as well, and to contribute to the promotion. This is an interesting fact because it was precisely by reading the official documents and then reading the national curriculum of the schools in Brazil, that's how we saw the importance of the contribution to the promotion of the citizenship and the sense of belonging of the individuals and their communities. In this case here, it's essential for us to think that these pedagogical proposals that we're calling lettering projects, in fact, they need to be based on the students. They need to center on the students because the students are the ones who are going to produce based on their experiences, based on the diverse types of discourse and genres. Then that's how we can think about that. And we can create different discourse genres in several platforms that we're using, and they're being created every day. And no one better than our students to bring this information by studying the names of places. And the society itself. So the society itself wants that this interdisciplinarity literacy project, we want to think in terms of what do the street names in our neighborhood tell us. This is just a proposal based on this multi-literacy. We're working on multi-literacy projects with social practices, this diversity of discourse genres that are produced every moment in several social spheres and in several different modal platforms. So at each time we have a different genre coming up, and we are amazed, we are astonished as a teacher sometimes, and the school is not ready for that either. So that's why it's important to have this possibility of giving the students the conditions to think based on the objects of knowledge that they have and that are defined by the professor, so they can produce literary genre and textual as well that are multimodal. So the idea of this interdisciplinary literacy project is here. My time is almost up. So the proposal for this interdisciplinary literacy project is to focus on what the street names have to tell us. And we have thematic units. And I'd like to stop a little bit here to see if I can show another screen.
Olha só, ainda tem tempo, não tem importância. É esse link que está aqui?
Isso, é o link do Padlet.
Então, vou entrar aqui para ver se vai funcionar. Que aí, pode ser?
Ótimo, pode ser, porque isso aqui eu vou me deter um pouquinho mais.
Yeah, I'm going to stop a little bit more here. So let's see if we can open the link.
Tá aparecendo?
Esse, ótimo, ótimo. Bom, a ideia aqui é pensar numa
Well, the
atividade.
idea here is to think of an activity based on this question. What do the names of the streets in our neighborhood have to tell us? So something that we're thinking about for the extension course that we will have for the teachers, promoted by Abrelin, Brazilian Association of Linguists. And the idea is to use active methodologies proposed by ABNCC. And here the idea is to use as methodology of rotation by stations. So we established here that the planning would be in 3 different stages. So we got here the 6th year, the first quarter. These objects of knowledge, they are based on a document from the state of Tocantins, from the program of the school that was approved in 2019. And it's a result, obviously, of a discussion from ABNCC. All of the schools need to approve their curriculum documents, the programs of the schools until 2022, next year. So Tocantins already approved for primary education, but still needs to do that for high schools. So now we have these knowledge objects for each year, objects of knowledge for each year for the basic primary education. And why did we choose the 6th year then in the school? Because that's where we identified when Professor Renato talked about literary toponymy, I was even thinking of ABNCC and how rich the possibilities of working on toponymy and literary toponymy that are regional. I mean, that would be so rich. That would be fantastic. And that's something that can be brought to the schools. Literary toponymy can be there. And also we can think about a regional state, regional literary toponymy as well. So what was the idea that we have here? We wanted to think of Portuguese language and remembering that interdisciplinarity, it has that focus on the schools. We're talking about school interdisciplinarity here. So here our interest was in teaching and learning. So we wanted to select the objects of knowledge that can have a conversation with other objects of knowledge from other areas. So we selected here geography and history, but it could be, for example, geography and arts, or geography, literature, and history, for example. So we have other activities in which we have this game with other subject matters. So it will depend on the object of knowledge. And this question is important. These activities are of interest to whom? Who are the people who are going to benefit from these activities? If we don't ask this question, the question would be, oh, this is interesting for us, the research group, but it's not interesting for the schools. But, it would be as if we were there only thinking about the scientific interdisciplinarity. Our motivations were important and necessary, of course. They were epistemological in nature, they were academic in nature, but they were not for the schools. And here, well, in this third stage here, you can see the learning objectives of the literacy project. So here we have several goals and learning goals, and all of them are related to the objects of knowledge that were defined in the curriculum that each school must provide, and the schools, the teachers can't choose. I mean, they have to follow the guidelines. So we wanted to facilitate the lives of the teachers and ours, of course, and to make everyone to have conditions, because we wanted the teachers to be interested as well, because they can say, no, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to discuss that. This is not good for me. So in a certain way, we need to advance in our dialogue. And so how is the proposal going to be then? We will work on active methodology, and then we work with inverted classrooms. So we want to provide videos, texts, podcasts with information about the names of streets, document the laws creating the municipalities. So we can think about several documents or activities that can be provided for the students. And most importantly, here we already see the creation of discourse genres, for example, like interviews. So students could talk to their parents, grandparents, families, to know if they know information about the name of a square, name of a street, of a neighborhood, of an avenue. So students already need to organize themselves to carry out the activities, and then they can transform that into podcasts, they can make documentaries, they can make videos, video blogs. So we're working on different genres this way, and students can use different modalities. And then the first station, we divided all of this into 3 stations. So we don't need to have a sequence, first, second, and third station, because the groups are divided. They are assigned into 3 groups. So we have 3 stations. The classroom would then be assigned into 3, but we could do that in 6. But here we only did that to facilitate for the presentation. So we can also assign 6 groups and 6 stations. And students, they end one activity, they go to the other. And each group will go to the 6 stations, for example. And in a certain way, they are doing the work and redoing it. So that information that was produced by group number 1 will be rewritten by 5 other groups. And in the end, the idea is that students can come up with several genres by using social networks, the media. I mean, you know, boys and girls, 12-year-olds, they are very creative. And the teacher does not even need to be concerned with that too much. They are very much capable of having a lot of diversity in that sense. So then what is the role of the student? What is the role of the teacher? We have that in station number 1. What would be the duration and what are the results? Those would be the products. What are the products in the end? So the idea is that this happens in 2, 3, or 4 classes, and the teachers along these classes, they are together with students producing several results and products, and those products are the result of these several discourse genres that they can use. And you see that our goal was not to talk about toponyms here. Students will study that, will raise information about the names, the toponyms, and motivation. They will come up with cartographic information as well, because there will be times in which the students will have to go through maps and study that depending on the object of knowledge together with the geography teacher. And so this is one activity. And together with that, in parallel, these pedagogical suggestions that we're calling literacy projects, we have another front. And she's asking him to put the SISTOP database up.
Isso, é na página mesmo. Veja se você consegue.
Tá nesse maisinho aqui do lado direito? Não, aqui
Isso.
Aqui?
Isso, esse daqui. Eu acho que agora eu posso... Vou tentar.
Você vai compartilhar aí? Tá bom.
Isso. Compartilhei, cursos d'água.
Tá funcionando.
Tá funcionando? Então, esse daqui é o nosso banco de dados.
This is our database that is still being developed, because we began in 2018, but then we ran out of money and we could not continue because the government stopped funding the project. But now in 2020, we had a PROCAD Amazonia project approved together with the Federal University of Paraná and Federal University of Santa Catarina. And so together with these two universities, we worked with toponymy in sign language, which is another project. And here, I'm in the administration part here because we're running out of time. I only brought this here to show you. This, we expect that it will work by February or March, and that we have the collaboration of our teachers and students. So here we have the team. We will have news, intellectual production here. We started to test the IT people who are helping us. So this was the first that we were able to include. And here in the intellectual production, that's where we want to enable the didactic and pedagogical material. So all of this material will be here in this intellectual production. Here we have the municipalities. We have how to register the toponyms here. And here we want to include other information. Here's where we will include content, the name of the municipality, the toponym, taxonomy, element, social, historical and cultural education, etymology, lexical input, more specific information. And for each one, there's a mistake here. It's not the toponyms here, it should be municipalities. And here, traditional communities, we have remaining communities and indigenous peoples. And here in indigenous peoples, what we want to do is to have a database that is specific for indigenous toponymy. Here we have water courses, especially for the two basins that we have here, Tocantins and Araguaia. So we will have two big tabs for them, and a work for the toponyms related to those two great rivers, Araguaia and Tocantins, as I mentioned. And in addition to that, we want to add a tab that we will call collaborative toponymy. So we already requested to have another tab here with this collaborative toponymy, and so that people can collaborate. So that's it for now. We need resources, of course. We're very excited, but we need resources, and we're working with Procad to have a second part of our funding so that we can conclude this database. And we have a proposal of an app that, together with this database, it would be for the patrimony of Palmas. And we have until March of next year to work with this app that would work with heritage. It's more specific for heritage. And the proposal is also for education. It's also focused on that, so that tourists can get to know a little bit more of the state and the places of interest in Palmas, which is the capital of Tocantins state in Brazil. And we can extend that to other touristic places in the state of Tocantins. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much. We still have a lot to do. And good thing about toponymy is that we have fantastic things. Each presentation is amazing. So we see a world in many places. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here. Thank you, Professor Leila and Renato. We have a few comments here on our chat and a few questions as well. I will try to systematize all of that in a way in which we can do that in time. We still have 15 minutes. So before I start the Q&A, I'd like to make a few comments about your presentation. It was excellent, your presentation. I was admired by the amount of work that you and your group develop. I watched another session, the oral presentation of Bruno and Carla, and they talk about toponymy and sign language, and the work was sensational. And Carla about BNCC and multiliteracy and toponomastics. We can see that all of this work is being developed, all of this work is being done in university, which has to do with teaching, research, and extension. We see that. And sometimes we are not able to reach the extension part of it, but everything that was presented here shows this commitment of yours. So just to have an idea very briefly here, Professor Gary, he said that he's amazed that you actually were able to go to the grassroots, really. So he's amazed at that. And Professor Mas is saying that both lectures were very interesting. Professor Menezes is amazed at the size of your work and the presentation of Renato as well. And Claudio João from IBGE, no, not IBGE, oh my God, no, Claudio João now belongs to UERJ, it's another university, saying that the works were very nice, very well presented. Taina also saying, and she's also from UFRJ, the Federal University of here. So actual questions, believe it or not, they come from Dublin, 3 hours ahead of us. So Professor Gary is there really watching us. That's wonderful. And he asked 2 questions to Professor Renato and 1 to Leila. First of all, I'm going to ask Renato. And so Renato, he asked, as well as the fantasy world, as you say, was there any form of utopian world ideals with Howard's work? No, there weren't. It was an instrumental world created by him based on religious principles of the theosophy, the association of several eras, one after another. So there was no utopia or dystopia. He did not work with those things. Right. He also said, I don't really know, but he said, do you find any parallels with Tolkien? Yes, there is. A lot of people said that Tolkien might have been inspired by Robert Howard, but maybe the best way to think about this would be to notice the way in which they thought. In Portuguese, in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a word called raciocinação, sort of like reasoning. I think it also existed in English, reasonization, something like that. It's the way in which a reasoning took place and happened. I think we can incorporate that to the toponymic idea. Robert Howard created an instrumental world. He created the story, the choreography of these worlds so that they could work with them. Tolkien did that in another way. Little by little, he produced and created parts of his world. And what's interesting is that, contrary to Robert Howard, Tolkien was an excellent drawer, right? He drew. And the sources say that there were several drawings that he made, even in the breaks that he had while teaching at Oxford. So he drew the components and the places that he used in his stories. So he assembled the parts and he got them together based on the drawings and then to cartography. And he was concerned with the distances and the times. So his world was a universe that mathematically grew little by little. Like, for example, when we read The Lord of the Rings, we know by means of the drawings that he made that he was aware of the time that the characters were going to walk on such and such days, and that the narrative of those characters would not cross the narrative of other characters who were in another place in the Middle Earth, and the Middle Earth was the universe of Tolkien. That's why I talked about raciocinação, the way that they reasoned, had reasons that were different. One was instrumental and the other was productive, let's say. And the toponyms and toponymy receives these contributions from them. Yeah, based on what you said, Professor, Howard's world was more symbolical, right? He created symbolisms based on maps that were already well known. And Tolkien had the idea that we call in cartography of geometrical transformation. He was concerned with scale. He was concerned also with symbology, but he was more concerned with scale based on what you're saying, right? Which is the idea of knowing how long am I going to take going from one place to another by walking or with a horse or other means of transportation. And the kilometers, right? The distance in kilometers, if it would take 1 day or 2 days walking or something like that. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but something occurred to me. And also the religious matter that fascinated Tolkien, because if theosophy was part of these reasoning in the world of Robert Howard, Catholicism was what was behind Tolkien's productions. Tolkien was very religious. He went to the mass every day. So all of that journey of the heroes in the Middle Earth, they have to do with purification, with the search. So matters of Catholicism, really. All right. So now I will also ask Dr. Carilea, also a question from Gary, and he asks, what are the reactions of your students to this approach? I don't know if he asked this directly to your students from the university or the students for the extension courses, but you can answer either way. Well, thank you, Professor Gary or Jerry. I hope I'm not saying it wrong. Anyway, I think it's a challenge to think of toponymy in teaching. It's a challenge because at first, I used to think that it was just a matter of taking toponyms there and showing them the cards that we work with, and that everything would be solved. One needn't be concerned with what the teacher or the school or anybody was doing. And then we realized that no, that was not the case. We have to, well, it's a metaphor of Rubem Alves, Brazilian writer that we use a lot in Brazil. We need to put and feel the floor of the school, in a very, very poor translation, I'm sorry. So when we think about toponymy applied to teaching, I need to feel the floor of the school. So I need to feel that what we are studying, in fact, has a purpose, has a goal, has an interest, because my students, if they are studying, well, they are interested in some way. They are devoted. And in fact, I do have a group that's very good. They're very enthusiastic about things. But the teachers in the schools, though, who works with toponyms? Well, geography teachers do, right? Those are the ones who are going to work with the notion and the discussion. And the literature teacher and the Portuguese language teacher, he can even work with names, but in a more grammatical and lexical sense. But he's not interested in etymological perspective many times, or historical, or cartographic, or anthropological. And the idea is to unite all of that, to gather all of that. This is our purpose, to get everything together, because in a certain way, the subject matters, they work with all of that, but they work each one in its own. So we want to have an interaction, and we want students to know the importance of studying, for example, place names. I believe that's what's most important, to know how important the study is, and why do we study all of that, right? And not just memorizing the names of the states and the names of the capitals of the states and names of streets. But why do we choose those names? What are the motivations? Who chooses those names? Who establishes the guidelines and the parameters for the choice of those names? Is that all political? Is that ideological? Is the city hall or the House of Representatives? Who does that? So then you create a network of contact and aspects that can and must be worked with. And what's most important is that students become aware of that, of their role, of their social role in naming these places. So who names something, names something because of an interest, because of a certain motivation. I believe it is a challenge, and it's been a good challenge, but we have been having a lot of work. Thank you, Carolina. Professor Menezes asked to say something, to say a few words too. So, Paulo, if you will. You have 2 minutes, Paulo. Yeah, I did not want to do an intervention or to say a few words. First of all, I wanted to congratulate both Renato and Carileila for these spectacular lectures. Regarding Carileila, for example, last year we had a thesis of Lobato that was defended here, and he talked about multiliteracy using toponymy and using games with maps made for children. Unfortunately, he's not here right now because his father passed away last Sunday, and he was involved in that. So it would be very fruitful for him. But congratulations for your project, Carileila. It's fabulous. And God hopes it can spread through the entire country. That's something that we're cheering for. We are cheering you on this. And Renato, one of the things that I say when I start teaching cartography is that the map is a certainty of the place. But this place can be in our imagination, and it can be in the real world. So all of this structure of the creation of the maps, and we mentioned Howard, you mentioned Howard, and you can mention Tolkien, and we can put Martin as well. And so a world opens up, and we can go to many other things, Star Wars, and all of this, and we can extrapolate our world and our time, and everything is made very much real. So you can't go from one place to another in a time that is not real. So the metric is present everywhere. I'm very enthusiastic with both presentations that you had. So I had to say that. I'm sorry, I did not want to say more because of our time, but thank you very much. Kari, Leila, and Renato, there are a few questions more and other comments on YouTube that I was able to turn it on now. But your contact information is there. And so I will ask people to contact you directly to clarify these doubts and also to get the comments to you. I believe this is important. I will thank you all for your presence then, all of you who have been watching here this lecture of the second Pan American International Symposium on Toponomy. Tomorrow our activities will begin at 9 a.m. So I already invite you to the lecture number 4, who will have Professor Marina Miraglia. She's a professor of the Universidad Nacional General Sarmiento in Argentina, and I just said that in Portugal, and Claudio Stene, who's the director of the Geosciences Center of our Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. And the videos will be available on YouTube. You can just write Geocart. You don't need to like or anything. You just need to access it and see it if you want. We don't make money from likes or anything else, and that's not the purpose of it anyway. And once again, thank you very much, Professor Nato, Professor Carilena, for the magnificent presentations that made SIPAT, as it's been so far, made it expand the borders beyond Brazil. So thank you very much to you, and thank you very much to all of you. Good evening to all, and thank you once again. See you next time in presence. Yes, in person, please. Okay, thank you.